Welcome to Conversaciones with Biblioteca Digital Pitts. My name is Deborah Enid Ortiz Rivera. I am the librarian at Pitts Theology Library, and here we are in this season talking about Entre la Historia y el Testimonio. History is the narrative of the events that shape our collective experience at both national and global levels. Conversely, testimonio, from the Latine perspective, reflects our life encounters with God's providence throughout these circumstances. Our theme for this season is Entre la Historia y el Testimonio, because we want to help you reflect on how these two dynamics shape our understanding of ministry and our life in God and in community. In our first episode, we will follow the general topic that we had assigned to the whole season, Entre la Historia y el Testimonio. We are so glad to have Alejandra Guajardo-Hodge as a co-host once again. Alejandra is a project manager at the Leadership Development Department of the Church of God of Prophecy. She serves also at her local church as a youth minister and is active in social work with migrants and refugees in her community and presenting on those topics in different theological forums. Professor Calvillo has a background in sociology and has authored 3 books where he explores faith, ethnicity, and culture. When the Spirit is Your Inheritance, Reflections on Borderlands Pentecostalism, The Saints of Santa Ana, and In the Time of Sky Rhyming. All of these titles are available through Biblioteca Digital Pitts. While you listen to this conversation, we invite you to reflect on the following. Do we allow a space for the testimonies of our students and community? How can we move from the mere narration of events to reflection on their impact on our daily lives and ministries? And whose stories are we leaving out of the syllabus?
Hola, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. It is a gift to engage with your work and to reflect together on theology, memory, and live faith through the work that you are doing. I've enjoyed our conversations in the past, and I just want to know how you're doing today.
Gracias, Alejandra. It's great to be here to talk about what we'll be discussing today, and it's great to be in conversation with you. I'm doing well today. I am excited for this conversation and looking forward to also hearing from you and some of your ideas.
Yes.
Mhm.
So we're going to talk about your book, When the Spirit is Your Inheritance. And I want to know a lot about it. But one of the first things that I want to know is the title of the book.
Yeah. So the 2 parts, When the Spirit is Your Inheritance, and then the second part, Reflections on Borderlands Pentecostalism. The first part is really tied to the personal aspect of the book. It's an
Mm-hmm.
autoethnography, which means that it's rooted in my own lived experience, but also very much based in the communities that shaped me and that I'm very much still connected to in a variety of ways, even though I've moved around and gone to different places. And then the second part, Reflections on Borderlands Pentecostalism, is a way to highlight where I'm coming from in these experiences and the communities that I'm talking about. They are, I would consider, borderlands communities, even though they're not directly on
The border.
the border,
Mm-hmm.
but the reality of borderlands, right? That's really
Yeah.
what I'm getting at here. What does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to inhabit a borderland space? And part of what I'm saying through my book is that the type of Pentecostalism that shaped me and that continues to shape me is very much influenced and is very much characterized by the borderlands experience.
Mm-hmm. What led you to choose this borderland approach? Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, well, certainly the work of Borderlands is indebted to the scholarship, the writings,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the concept, is very much indebted to the work of Gloria Anzaldúa,
Right.
right? Uh, and she didn't create that word borderlands. It's been around, but she really
Mhm.
brought that concept to the day-to-day realities of what it means to be in these liminal spaces, right, between um, or alongside of empire, where there is such a high degree of inequality, and what it means to have this type of consciousness, to be in between worlds, right, and to
Mhm.
create this third space, right,
Mhm.
where it becomes a reality unto itself. It's not just an experience of exclusion, but it's also a community unto itself. We inhabit this space in community, and so from that, I wanted to be in conversation with some of the other scholars that are talking about borderlands as a reality for Pentecostales. For
Mhm.
uh, especially, I would say, in the Southwest, which is,
Mhm.
geographically where I grew up in. But then I moved east, and so
Mhm.
what I came to realize was that the borderlands experience is much more expansive than just the Southwest or Southern California, where I grew up. I experienced different types of borderlands on the East Coast and the Northeast, and now in the South. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, so I think it's a reality that a lot of people can relate to,
Mhm.
and I also believe that it's one that has shaped Pentecostalism deeply,
Mhm.
from its early beginnings. Modern Pentecostalism it is very much, or has very much been, a borderlands movement.
Mhm. I love that. I was excited when I read the title of the book because I am from a border town. So I'm
Mhm.
actually from the border, but I agree with you. I think the borderlands I've experienced in my life, I lived in many places, but I've experienced those borderlines in different ways, not only in my border experience, but living in the southeast of the United States. It is a different type of borderline, a different type of experience, and within the church. I want you to talk more about how you mentioned it briefly. How does borderlands take place within Pentecostalism? And also, how can that help us challenge dominant narratives about who Pentecostals are?
Yeah. Well, number one, I would start with the history of Pentecostalism and where uh, that connection to the broader Latine community and Pentecostalism, where that emerged from. And so we can see it both in the early accounts of what was going on at the Azusa Street Revival, and we can also see it in places like Texas, where some of the first Spanish speaking and bilingual Pentecostal churches were emerging. And so at the Azusa Street Revival, we had the presence of uh, Latine peoples, mostly of Mexican descent, uh, but that quickly began to diversify as well. But what I like to point out is that in those early days of the Azusa Street Revival, Mexican participants were some of the first. Uh, they were some of the first to sort of cross into the movement, to experience the movement not just in a passive, uh, receptive way, but also in an innovative way, and to be on the forefront of what was happening. And so we see, some of the first religious conversions, some of the first baptisms in the Holy Spirit, which is again such a key doctrine in Pentecostal theology. Some of the first accounts of healing, um, both in terms of the person testifying to healing, and then also the person praying for someone else to be healed. And so Pentecostals were very much involved. I'm sorry, Mexican Pentecostals were very much involved in the movement from the beginning, all the way down to the fact that there was an account that mentions that Pentecostals wanted to testify And when they weren't allowed to testify, that signaled a decline in the movement, in the revival, um, in the first few years of the Azusa Street revival. And so, again, it's not a movement that our peoples were um, strangers to. I mean, we got to experience the beginning and to help contribute to that. And so the connection there in terms of borderlands is that a lot of the folks that were experiencing that were living on the margins of society. These were folks that were laborers, typically. Some of a lot of them were migrants. Uh, some would have been indigenous. In fact, there is an account mentioned, which I like to cite from Dr. Daniel Ramirez, where he talks about a Mexican man that was referred to as an Indian. And so we had indigenous representation there as well within the Mexican community. And but socially, what that meant was that these were primarily folks on the margins of society. So they embodied that type of borderlands experience that we mentioned earlier. And so again, across those migration patterns and through the routes of labor, these early Pentecostales took their faith with them, right? And then we encounter these early networks converging, through migration and through even evangelistic efforts and whatnot. So then some of the folks coming from, let's say, the West Coast are then encountering some of the folks that were having these also revival meetings out in, let's say, Texas. And then you have the Puerto Rican experience, encountering the Pentecostal message in Hawaii. And so then some of those migratory and labor routes converging with some of and crossing paths and intersecting with some of the Mexican labor paths. And so Pentecostalism in the Latinx community really early on became this sort of pan-ethnic experience as well. I think that I tend to think that Pentecostalism was on the forefront of bringing people together, even in this sort of early Latinidad consciousness. And I want to do more writing about that in the future. But certainly folks were starting to collaborate. And to me, that's part of the Borderlands experience, because it was happening not with people sort of in the upper echelons, the religious elite. These are working class people. These are people that were moving around because they were trying to survive, right? And trying to find a way to make a living. And they're encountering Pentecostalism along the way, and then they're taking it with them wherever they go. So to me, that's very much characteristic of the Borderlands realities, and having to cross cultures and having to adapt culturally, and uh, both adapting in a new context, but also adapting with folks that are diverse, together, doing that adaptive work together. So some of that is happening as well. And also discrimination. Folks are experiencing discrimination both in the early hierarchies and institutions that begin to form. And so it wasn't a perfect story of everyone embracing everyone. Some of those early Latina leaders encountered barriers to leadership and whatnot. So that's a big part of it. That's a big part of that Borderlands experience, the history. And then I would say, fast forwarding into the future, I know I'm jumping over a lot of historical periods, but I'll just say, in my own experience growing up, that Borderlands reality was continued to be present through what we experienced in church. Our churches were very much pan-ethnic and multi-ethnic. We think of, well, if it's a Latino church, if it's a Latina Pentecostal church, well, it's one ethnicity, right? Well, no, it was actually really diverse, right? We had folks from, you know, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, you know, in the LA area, yeah, sure, Mexicans we were, and I'm Mexican American. We often were the majority, but we're also learning from our brothers and sisters, our siblings that are coming from all different places. And so it's an opportunity for us to expand in our understanding as well culturally. So it wasn't like this monolithic group coming together. So that to me was part of the borderlands reality, where we're already having to adapt and learn from each other, and understanding our shared struggles, and also understanding some of our differences, and some of the ways that we can also um, hurt each other, even, harm each other, right?
Yeah.
So working through some of that. So those are all borderland realities. And one
Mm-hmm.
last thing I'll say is, both in my own experiences growing up and up until the modern day, we see the ways our churches continue to experience vulnerability with what's happening around immigration.
Yeah.
Both along the border, but all, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, all around geographically, this experience of liminality, our peoples are feeling that in such a heavy way right now, with what's going on with
Yes.
ICE,
Mm-hmm.
and Border Patrol. And I tell people that often Pentecostal churches are amongst the most vulnerable institutions in this moment. And we can talk about that a little bit more
Yeah,
if you'd like, but
that
that's
is
part of
right.
the borderlands reality. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Man, right now that you mentioned, I have this picture came to my mind because, like, as I was saying, I grew up in a border. So I was so used to, so accustomed seeing, all these different levels of enforcement because that is the border. It is common. You see it in the streets, you see it in the restaurants, you see people around driving around, and as you mentioned the immigrant experience in this moment, I'm thinking about how it's almost as if the border moved, and it's not like people were
Mm,
not experiencing this level of vulnerability before in different spaces, but I am seeing that placement, and that liminality state enhanced in a way that I've never seen it before. So thank you for helping me reflect on that. And
mm,
I love that in your book you start with that testimony of your
yeah.
family that you I don't think I've seen that done in any other book. I might
Mm,
not be reading a lot of books at the moment, but I I love that you include your mother, your grandmother, the story
mhm,
of faith, but also of living in that borderland experience. And I love that in the introduction you pointed out, how in the book you speak about how your family members encounter the Holy Spirit in La Frontera and experience
mhm,
Pentecostalism as a faith forged in the borderlines. And then part of that reflection is to point out that the Spirit both crosses borders and inhabits fronteras. And I love that. That
mhm,
is not either or, it is not or, but it's both. It crosses borders and also inhabits fronteras. And there are moments of finality and completion in the spirit, and moments of waiting and liminality in
mm,
the spirit. That is just beautiful. And I want to talk more about that aspect of testimony in
yeah.
writing this book, but also how it brings us directly into the heart of how we are formed in our communities, and how we experience the Holy Spirit. And in my own work, I spend time thinking about testimonio as a way of challenging. My area is ethics, so I think about how testimonial challenges constructions of ethics,
Mm,
because not everything is
wow,
clear cut when
yeah.
there are certain things that are said about how things should work ethically, but then you have a testimony that defies those definitions and those constructions. So you also define testimonial as both a verb and a noun for Pentecostal. So can you walk me through that aspect of testimonial, how that was, your method to get to those conclusions, but also that definition both as a verb and a noun for Latino Pentecostals?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. And I'm really interested in what you're finding in your own work around that with ethics, um, particularly with what's happening right now, and the ways that, for example, the laws can alter um, the status of people that are here already. And people like to, um, critics like to categorize our people's experiences in this, put us in a box, right? And so, oh, well, you're this and this is your status, because according to, not realizing that, or not admitting or acknowledging how, liminality is this shifting experience, right? Because our statuses can so often shift and be changed based on those who are in power. But anyways, going to the testimonial aspect of it. So one thing I'll begin by saying that I recognize that testimonial would be a part of writing the book. It would be an important, a foundational piece to writing this book. And then along the way, I started to think of, well, what is testimonial? Like what are testimonials accomplishing? So I didn't necessarily start with that question. I started more with an acknowledgement that testimonials as practices were such an important part um, of the Borderlands Pentecostal experience, right? That's and I'll share why in a moment. But in terms of the methods, I knew that the methods would involve gathering some of the testimonials of my own family, right? Some of it would be me sitting down and having conversations with people, and then for those that weren't with us anymore, trying to piece together some of the testimonials that had been passed on, and that and even looking at things like material culture and digital culture, and piecing together some of the stories that way. So testimonials was very much part of what helped to build this book. Like the building blocks of this book very much drew on testimonials. What I discovered as I was writing the book, and some of the conclusions I came to, and I'm still, to be honest, I'm still working on these, and meaning I'm adding on to where I landed in the book. And what I recognized was that testimonials serve multiple purposes. So certainly in the moment, testimonials are a practice within many of our churches, a practice of giving thanks, right, and of acknowledging something that God has done in the life of the believer. And uh, on a surface level, we could even say testimonials are like a story, right, that people are telling about themselves. And from a very human perspective, and something I describe in the book, that they're very much these practices of self-making. So yes, in terms of spiritual practice, they are very much centered on encounters with God, and these sacred moments that people experience. But on a human level, they're also these practices of self-making, meaning that the testimonials also help people understand who they are, and understand their place in the world, and understand who they are in relationship to God, for example. And so what I began to recognize, the more and more that I thought about how I experienced testimonials and participated, and still do, in the practice of testimonials, I realized that we're often taught in our churches that testimonials are these like packaged, these little packaged stories that we present, and almost like you write a book and it's a done deal, right? The book is there, right? But no, they take on a life of their own, and they're part of this ongoing process. The testimonials are not like a done deal that you stepped up, you shared a testimony. It's very much tied to oral culture, by the way, in our churches, right? And it's one of the primary ways that we sustain our practices in our culture and our community, through the actual auditory practice. But I began to realize, as I thought about across years, sort of taking a step back and thinking across the years, how I experienced people's testimonials, and even my own. These were not done deals. They were not stories that sort of had closure, or 100% closure. These were these dynamic, living, ongoing narratives, right? And it was interesting for me to think about, for example, how certain hermanos and hermanas in the church that I got used to hearing their testimonials often in church, right? And sometimes we kind of knew what to expect from certain people. Like we knew like, oh, this one's kind of a downer. Like this person's kind, their testimonials are not really so uplifting. They're kind of more here to share in some of their hardship. And there were some that were very uplifting. There were some that were really funny, and we kind of, oh look, we as young people, oh, there's so and so's going up now, look, get ready for the joke or whatever, and we just knew certain people were very humorous in their testimonials. But as I looked at it across the years, I realized I could see these sort of evolving stories through the testimonials. People were adding to their testimonials, and there was a communal aspect, right? Because we were responding, the congregation was responding, uh, but people were also responding. The people giving the testimonials were also responding to the ongoing life experiences they were going through. So testimonials were more of this ongoing conversation with the congregation, with God, even with themselves, right? It was an ongoing dialogue. And so I began to think about that as also connected to even my own spiritual experience, my own spiritual journey, thinking about my own story as it continued to develop. And earlier you mentioned, the idea of that liminality, even in the testimonial, right? Where, yeah, often the single testimonial might be like, tied up nice and neat with a bow, but the ongoing story isn't always nice and neat, right? It's developing, it's evolving. It sometimes has twists and turns. We're often taught to be en victoria, and we give that testimony en victoria, in victory. Uh, but what about those moments where it's not, where it doesn't feel en victoria, or where it really isn't, where it's tragic, and we have the outcome that we hoped wouldn't happen, and so we have to account for those too in our testimony. Those are part of our testimonials as well, and we have to account for those moments of waiting where it's not finalized. And what about when the lack of finality is extended over a long period of time? What do we do with that? Does that mean that suddenly we don't have a testimonial, or our testimonial isn't valid because we haven't gotten the response or the outcome that we hope for? Beginning to wrestle with that, and I would even say perhaps pushing against the tendency that I saw sometimes in church to categorize everything in a nice and neat way, right? And to have that really, you know, that victorious testimony. It always has to be that way. And what I realized was that, and what I came to acknowledge was that even though that wasn't always articulated outwardly in the church, meaning, I'm sorry, to be clear, the part about being victorious was often articulated. The part about waiting and that liminality wasn't always articulated, but it was there. It was there. And so
Wow.
what is it to acknowledge that, right? What is it to create space for that in a more conscious way? And a part of me would say, you know what? We've done it. We just need to do a better job of acknowledging it. It's been a part of our testimonial experience ongoing. Our churches do that, but we haven't allowed ourselves to acknowledge that part of it, because we want to get the resolution. We want to get the outcome we prayed for, or asked for, or hoped for. And so being more conscious, being sitting with that, sitting in that borderlands reality, I think is where I landed. And I
Wow.
continue to, yeah.
I love that because I'm thinking about how, you know, testimony shapes our theology, our understanding of God,
Mm-hmm.
and how understanding as an action, like something that has that progressive trajectory other than that one and done situation,
Yeah.
it really shapes how we produce theology. A reflection of the the moments of liminality, a reflection of moments of waiting, a reflection on where is God in that waiting process. And it is a process of faith seeking understanding when you see it that way. Not only the victory part of it, where we learn to see God in a particular type of light, which affects, I think, has an effect on how of image and constructions that we make of who God is, right? If we are always used to that victory type of idea, we tend to see God as a warrior. We tend to see God in a particular way, this strong warrior type of mentality. But when you see God in the waiting, it looks different. It can look as God as a comforter, God as a shepherd, the interaction of God as a provider, or simply the silence in the moments of waiting. So there's so much that is done there.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, what are some ways in which testimonials could invite that critical reflection? Because even as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, there is, I've learned to see my life as this is a testimony of what has done, um, as different aspects change, as I go from different stages in life, as I face different hardships, as I'm in different borderlands. Um, I think that when I grew up with a different background, and I was not used to the testimony part. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and that's the tradition that I still carry strongly with me. But then I entered Pentecostal churches, and it was like I have to have something to say, like I have to be happy about something on Sunday, or like I always felt like I had to say something or overcome something in order to share that testimony, because there was not a storytelling of the waiting part, at least not in my first encounters. But then I began to see that how God was weaving my own story, and I learned to critically reflect on that as well. And then with theology added to it, I think that I went back and revisited parts of how I perceived my testimony, and in that sense, it played the aspect of memory comes into play. Like, how do you remember your own story? How do
Yeah.
you experience it in the moment, but then how do you remember it later on? So what are some ways in which we could invite critical reflection to those spaces? How can also testimonials function as theological accountability?
Wow. Okay. Your questions in some ways already offer some really helpful interventions, I think, and I guess you're asking a lot of really good questions that I think in some ways would be helpful for folks to engage in those questions, right?
Mhm.
So even the questions themselves, I think, are a practice
Okay.
that I would love to see. That those very questions that you asked, I think, are really could be really helpful to folks. Um, you know, the idea of memory and remembering that you described, testimonio is a part of that, and at the same time, often our communities that we belong to, because it's very much a communal experience, and I'm going to come back to that point in a moment, but often our communities shape our testimonios, what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say. And so one practice could be to engage in this memory experience, and to be willing to look at some of the parts that perhaps we're not always encouraged to say or allowed to say, because I think um, communities can have like a formula sometimes of what's an acceptable testimonio, and I think folks like a blueprint almost, that people are a template, that people are expected to follow, and those things can be good in some ways. I mean, there are pros and cons to it. I think that I think now, because I'm a sociologist, I think now it's easy for me to see this from through the lens of power and say, oh, well, people are being policed in what they can say, and that's bad. But I also understand that ritual can also be part of the faith experience. And so, in that sense, testimonials can be a form of ritual, and so even the formulaic aspect can offer folks a sense of peace, for example, and encouragement, by having sort of these expectations that so people follow certain guidelines and they engage in this practice. It falls. I would put that into even though it looks like it's being made up on the spot and whatnot, it can become a type of ritual, right? And I know that in Pentecostal circles we don't necessarily like to talk about ritual. That's not necessarily the language we use. So the first part that I'm saying is, yes, there might be a place for having these sort of guidelines and for people to have certain expectations. I get that. I get that that happens in all different types of faith communities. But the practice of remembering, encouraging folks to remember and think about their testimonials outside of the formula, not just repeating the same thing, not just always highlighting the same exact thing. Often our testimonials begin to look differently as we look back. There are things that in the past we might have thought were not important, or were not holy or sacred, and we recognize that some of these very mundane aspects, um, sometimes those are the things where we encounter God's divine presence, right? And so that practice of remembering, I think, is helpful, but even how we remember and how we allow ourselves to remember, and what we allow ourselves to remember. So that's one thing. And then I want to add the communal aspect, because I think that we need to, just like I said, to move away, it's helpful to sometimes move away from the formula. Do we have people in our lives that we can move away from the formula with? Because sometimes we're in communities that don't allow us to do that. Do we have people in our lives that we can share those testimonials with, but the real, unfiltered, non-manicured, non-cosmetic, non-aesthetic kind of testimonio, right? And sure, some of that is about simply having folks to do life with and to talk to. And yeah, that's part of it. But even specifically around this question of testimonials, right? Folks that we can explore our journeys with, right? Where we've been, where we're going, that are not going to immediately judge us, that are not going to immediately tell us, wait, that's not God. That's not what a believer can say or think about. And I'm grateful that being at Candler, being on the faculty at Candler School of Theology, I get to work with some great colleagues and students, and I like to create space in my classes. I know that it's limited how much we can talk about and be personal, but I want for students to see that model, the space where we can be honest and wrestle with where we've come from, where our communities have been, uh, those sacred journeys that are not always linear. And that's another theme, by the way, the circularity of our stories, that we sometimes end up back in places where we've already been or where our ancestors have been. So the testimonio doesn't start with us. And that's maybe another point I would bring up. So there's the communal aspect, and then I'll say that communal aspect, community aspect, it's not even just in the here and now in our present. It goes back to our ancestors. And so I encourage folks to think about how sometimes our stories go through these cycles, right? Through these circular experiences. And that's very much a part of the Borderlands experience as well, because our folks, our peoples have been migrating for generations. We've been going back and forth. And that's another thing that, when I gathered the testimonials of some of my family members, I realized, wow, we have been circulating. We've been circulating for a long time. You know, we think that the things happening now are so unique and distinct, and yes, there are some different things happening we have to be attentive to, but in other ways, we've been through some of this, and so our testimonios, if we take it back, we start to see the circulation and the circularity that sometimes is there. And some might see that in a negative light and say, oh, okay, well, those are, um, negative cycles that we have to break. And I understand that, we don't necessarily want to continue to
Hmm.
repeat some of the hardships. I don't want to romanticize some of those things,
Yeah.
right? We want liberation.
Yeah.
And I think that there is liberation in the spirit. Um, but we learn something. We gain something. We gain wisdom from looking at our testimonials, even beyond, not like we're not the beginning. The testimonial didn't start with us.
Hmm. Wow. You've given me so much to think about.
Mhm.
My mind is just taking everything in, even as I was mentioning my own work.
Mm.
Something I'm thinking about is how in that, one of the things that led me to explore the idea of testimony was hearing testimonies of people crossing the border and their
Mhm.
interpretation of how God intervened in that process. How is it that God was with them in the journey? And it was not like, I would say, um, it was not rare to hear, things like God hid me. Um,
Mm.
you know and that challenges our concepts of ethics, because we think about deontological ethics, or we think about theological ethics, we think about all this type of ethics. Either when once you break a law, you break every law, or it is you have to break, sometimes you have to break a law to accomplish something good. And there's a lot of constructions that surround how we perceive good and bad, even outside of how we would judge those things in the biblical way, or from the biblical text perspective. And what I have found is that God inhabits those borderlands and crosses those borderlands,
Yeah.
and ends up challenging how we construct our ideas of what things should look like. And so even that aspect of God hid me, or God, I was in the desert and God provided for me. It's like, how is it that a God can help someone in the process
Mm.
of doing something that otherwise is seen as illegal, correct? And so
Yeah.
that's a clash that we have to wrestle with. And I love everything that you've said, because it makes me think of that circularity, that reflection, that those aspects of how those, even how some traditions or some groups would challenge those testimonies because they don't fit a particular narrative, or they don't fit a particular way of interpreting doctrine, or a particular hermeneutic. And all that I can think of is just how the spirit and is like the wind that blows in whichever direction, and we just don't know. And we have to be attentive and open to be able to see that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love the way you describe that, and the biblical imagery you bring in, uh, the image of the wind, for example, and the connection with wind and spirit, and even linguistically, that connection is there, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that moment of, when we find ourselves in these liminal experiences, liminal statuses, liminal spaces. Uh, and this goes back to something you said earlier, but we might think that the work of the Spirit is simply to get us through that and get us to the other side, and and yes, sure enough, that's what's needed, because there might be danger
Hmm.
or harm or risk, um, but also to recognize that, um, el espíritu está en las fronteras.
Right.
The Spirit is in the
Hmm.
borderlands,
Yeah.
in those spaces, right?
Yeah.
Um, so
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. um I will have to pay a visit to Emory and continue our conversation. But
Yeah.
thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us to see theology through sharing your story, the story of your family, testimony, and allow us to see the movement of the Spirit across borders and inhabiting the borders. So your work is so important, and it really challenges to listen more closely to the voices and practices and that have carried deep theological wisdom in our own tradition, and also help to see and challenge things and help us see things differently. So I'm so appreciative of your work, and I'm very thankful that you had invested this time to share that perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alejandra. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
Yes, it's good talking to you, and we'll see each other soon, hopefully.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Biblioteca Digital Pitts is a project of Pitts Theology Library in collaboration with the Association for Hispanic Theological Education. You can reach us at the info on the screen. See you next time.